Hey, welcome back to Guardbeardia. This is Guard here with you with Chapter 5 of The Veil Riders. It's pretty early in the morning here. I got a cup of joe, so tally-ho and on we go. Chapter 5. The deluge of questions that came rushing at Yule was enough to make his head spin, but it spun a little less with sleep at one of the local inns, and a belly full of food that didn't come dehydrated or out of a pouch. Yule had a pang go through his chest during breakfast when he thought of the eggs, and how they would probably begin to rant and rave about him eating fancy bacon and oatmeal. Whether they were okay or not, he did not know, and that lack of information really bugged him. He looked up while chewing on a particularly meaty egg white and surveyed the dining area of the inn, and the Veil Riders scattered within. The sparkling unicorn was going above and beyond the call of hospitality when the wizardess announced they were all guests of the city and was hosting them for free. Yule had an idea that it had something to do with their unit patch, but was more than happy to accept the bed and free chow. What he did not like was the lack of plumbing. Something that every Veil Rider was coming to grips with. Pooing in a hole in the woods is one thing. Having a special pot for your rear roast was another. And then knowing you had to carry your own special soup down to a special hole to dump it was a true otherworldly experience. Yule drummed up some NCOs for his Veil Riders and told them to mind the fort while he waited outside for the wizardess. She was going to take him in for questioning again in a more formal setting, this time about the perceived threats coming through the veil and about his own purpose here. He stood in front of the inn, nodding and waving to the elves around him. Here and there he saw some of the other races. There were free folk here. A mixed melody of orcs, dwarves, giant types, folks with strange horns on their heads, and even a few harpies clicked their way here and there along the road, busily speaking to their friends in their short, chirpy language. I wonder how smug that Monmusu guy will be when he learns he was right about harpies, Yule said aloud to himself, idly chewing on a piece of what tasted a lot like rye bread. Who is Monmusu? The wizardess had stalked behind him from a short alleyway, leaning forward and poking her head around the corner and spooking the absolute shit out of Yule, who swatted at the air around her with his hands, sending his bread spiraling into the street. The mohawked rat that grabbed it squeaked, quite pleased with itself. Fuck's sakes, don't do that. The last thing I want to do is draw an accident and send people scattering. The wizardess just giggled and bid Yule good morning, and the two made their way through the busy street towards a larger manor on the inside of the city walls. They had requested Yule come alone, ask questions, and in return they were going to stay on the city's dime. This was, naturally, sketchy, and Yule had multiple knives in his boots and his M9 in his holster, while leaving his K2 behind with an NCO for safekeeping. The wizardess kept insisting on holding his hand to make sure he didn't get lost, reaching over for it or trying to sneakily get a hold of his fingers. Yule wasn't for it in case she tried to take over his mind or something, and always yoinked his hand away, until he finally just shoved his hands in his pockets. Not wanting to be outmaneuvered and admit defeat, she hooked a finger in one of his belt loops, both of them satisfied with the silent negotiation. The walk to the meeting location actually went pretty smoothly, except for the gawking, and Yule was ushered inside to a larger group of elves along with a few other races mixed in. He expected this, but a few of the races were not present. The fancier, moodier elves that, as he learned, resided to the south of the Veil did not have any representatives here in the city. There was, however, valley elves, dwarves, and a few of the horned people there. Yule stood in front of them, staring at the little collection of fantastical creatures in the room. There was a kind of agreed pause as they let Yule just gaze at them, his eyes falling on one, then the other, in a polite progression of recognition. Yule turned to the wizardess with an awkward smile on his face. Never thought I'd see something like this. These beings of our stories, things that were told to us as children, subjects of our fantasy books, yet here they are, right in front of me. Can I shake the dwarf's hand? I'm curious how strong the grip is. The wizardess snorted with laughter, and he actually heard her switch into the dwarven language, which sounded a lot like Norwegian or Icelandic, but he didn't really hear any words he understood. The dwarf listened to her curiously, then barked out in his own laughter, slapping his knees happily before holding out his huge vice grip of a hand to Yule. Yule took it, and quickly learned that dwarves could probably weld metal together with just a pinch. After this, Yule took a moment to just indulge himself, and the elven woman was able to convince the other race ambassadors to let him do so. He was allowed to lightly touch the tip of the horned race's head spikes, in trade for letting one of the women play with his fingers, checking out Yule's nails and finger pads. The other horned race ambassador was a male, and wanted to look at Yule's boots and uniform, rubbing the cloth between his fingers and running his nail lightly on the scuffed black leather of Yule's boots. The dwarf wanted to, naturally, look at Yule's pistol. Yule cleared it and handed the dwarf the pistol and the ejected round of 9mm. The dwarf was busily taking the M9 apart and looking at the various pieces when Yule looked over at the elven wizardess. "Why am I here? You didn't bring me here to play with my fingers and house my troopers for free." The elf nodded once, and began to walk behind the row of ambassadors, of which the dwarf was admiring the spring of the pistol and holding it up to the light. "This is true. You and your people are the first to ever come through the Amurian gate in any real number." Yule furrowed his brows. "First in any real number? Some of you come through, every once in a while. I don't think they mean to. Their clothes are always different skin colors, different eye colors, different languages spoken by them. It appears the Amurian gate has gotten bored of its lack of use in all these years." The elf pulled out an old tome and opened it, the spine cracking from age. All the ambassadors looked up to her and watched her flip through the pages. "You have been tracked all this time. The little instances of when your people have survived the first few minutes from the gate. Very precious few have made it to Sanrion or another village. The only instance before you were a group of men who said they got lost hiking. They said they were Deutsch and served under a Maximilian." Yule blanched. "There were Landsknechts here. How long ago was this?" The elf looked down at the book in her hands. Appears this was recorded roughly 110 or so years ago, if my math is correct." Yule reeled, actually reacting bodily to the news and taking a few steps backwards. Yule's mind raced. That was over 600 or so years ago when the Landsknechts worked under Maximilian. What kind of wormhole is going on here? Yule turned back to the elf, placing his hands together and pointing them at her. They were soldiers. They functioned roughly 600 years ago, from our time. What the hell's going on with this place? The elf looked to the other ambassadors and translated what Yule said, and one of the horned folk, the female, spoke up. Her voice was almost a seductive purr as she moved her hands in different directions of each other. The two spoke back and forth for a few minutes, and the elf turned back to Yule. However, when she spoke to Yule, he just heard the same language, and he furrowed his brows and tapped his ear a few times. The elf sighed like her remote control stopped working, and pulled out a knife from the insides of her robes. It was then that Yule remembered the dwarf was still playing with the pieces of his pistol, and suddenly he was worried about two things rather than one. She pulled a bottle from one of her pouches and poured a few drops into the little necklace she held near her head when she spoke. But then she made a little slice on her finger with the knife, squeezing the digit so a steady stream of blood flowed into the necklace. Yule stared, one eyebrow raised while the other furrowed wildly at what she was doing. However, from how she acted, with such a nonchalant attitude, Yule assumed that she must do this all the time. The elf licked her finger, then stuck it in her mouth while shaking the necklace in her other hand, and when she was satisfied the mixture was shaken enough, she held it back near her forehead, and continued talking to Yule. He, however, held up his hand. She looked surprised and raised her eyebrows. Yule bobbed his head forward slightly, then turned up his hands in a questioning motion. "Are you going to tell me what the fuck all that was about?" "What? The bloody finger?" "Yes, I'm referring to you cutting your finger. I have to keep the translation amulet fueled for it to work. With blood? Yule was incredulous, and looked from the elf to the other beings and held out his hands in a universal sign of, is she for real with this shit? The dwarf had broken down every part of his M9 by this time, and was studying the trigger mechanism, ignoring everything else in the room, while the other elves and the horn folk just shrugged, not knowing what Yule just said. The elf, however, just giggled and patted Yule on the shoulder. This is how magic works here. You either need Dwarven Agni Umingi. The dwarf held up his fist in a cheers type motion while squinting at the extractor of the M9. Or you need good quality blood to power magical artifacts or cast spells of power. Yule was dumbfounded, staring at her as she continued. Anyway, Miss Yui here said her people, the Oni, have been working with the Brim Touch, and have a theory that our worlds work on different planes, like two wheels side by side. Yours spins faster than ours, causing time to stretch between the two sides of the gate. When the two sides of the gate are extremely close, time is even on each side. But as your side begins to move past, time stretches, you going forward and leaving ours behind until it aligns again. Those who wander through the veil during the big stretches are wandering in from different times unrelated to our own. Your own time speeding past us and leaving us behind. For the longest time, we were ahead of you in technology and intelligence, when your people were... She flipped through the pages, clicking her tongue as she did. But simple creatures wrapped in furs and wielding sharpened sticks. But your world, your time, you're outpacing us extremely quickly. And for the first time, the veil has been big enough that a whole village of you have come through at once. And now you're telling us that more of you with bad intentions will be coming through? Yule tightened his lips, deep in thought. All their eyes were on him as his mind whirled and roared with the gears of his brain gnashing together. Time is going to race by on their side of the world compared to this one. People are going to age faster over there, and the longer they stay here, the faster their world is going to pull away and stretch time like a fresh cheese stick. He and Coco had split their forces and fled away from the veil to get space. But now that means they ran from the only way to get back into their world and get back to their families. The longer they stay here, the longer their loved ones are going to be propelled into the future. Yule knew that none of his Veil Riders had husbands or wives, but they still had families. Then there was the issue of the blue helmets being on American soil, and what they may do next. Yule ran his hand from his mustache down to the end of his beard, staring at the ground. He needed to get back to his Veil Riders and break the news. They still had their markers, and those who wanted to would be able to get back home. Yule looked up from his thoughts and locked eyes with those before him. Let me tell you about the UN, and why you need to be careful about my people. My Veil Riders and I did not come here in the beginning with good intentions. My world is a hungry place, and you guys are more or less an all-you-can-eat buffet. Let me tell you why I'm going to stay, and why some of my people may need to go back home. Let me tell you about what may come. Some hours later, Yule opened the door to the sparkling unicorn and skulked in, closing the door behind him to keep the deafening cacophony inside from deafening those outside. Inside, the Veil Riders were roaring and shaking their mugs at some bard that was singing and dancing about on a small stage, and Yule spied one of those translation amulets strapped on her head. Yule assumed she was one of the Brim Touch, judging from the rear-anchored horns on her head and the pupilless eyes that were sparked with the delight that all entertainers had as they got high from the crowd's reaction. She danced and sang on the stage, the amulet changing her words to American English, spinning a yarn about a dragon who fell in love with a blind dwarf, and his Veil Riders were drunk enough to cheer at anything at this point. Yule waved his NCOs over, taking his K2 back and slinging it over his shoulder, before pulling them in close. Company meeting in the morning. I have bad news and weird news, and we need to get word to Zerg Company in the morning. Ask Gremlin if she knows a way. Make sure the lads don't get taken to bed by that prancing demon on stage. Good night. Yule clapped him on the shoulders, then turned away, thumping up the stairs to the room he was given by the inn. He closed the door behind him, kicked the door stopper in to jam it shut, and began to get ready for bed. It's funny how the things one can learn playing Dungeons and Dragons can come in handy when not on Earth. He was mentally fried, and rubbed his palms under his eyes as he sighed heavily. We were so gung-ho and just ran into the unknown. Only saving grace is that most of my men and women are single and looking for fantasy ass. Yule stared out the window into the dancing lights of the city, and quietly wrung his hands as his thoughts buzzed and sparked in his brain. The next morning, as all the Vale Riders gathered groggily into the main room of the Sparkling Unicorn to hear what Yule had to say, the elven barmaids were making sure to pass around big glasses of water and oatmeal. There was also an issue of one of the female Vale Riders coming down later than the rest, having the collar of her shirt folded up and desperately trying to pat her hair down. Yule looked from her then to his NCOs. The NCO that caught Yule's eye pulled the spoon from his mouth and said one word around his full cheek of oatmeal. Bard. He only did say lads, you know, piped up another, who then pointed to the NCO who the female Vale Rider was under. Yule stared at him, and the NCO at least had the decency to cough into his fist and try to look somewhere else besides Yule or the female Vale Rider with the bite marks all over her neck and collarbones. Yule had to take a few minutes to suppress his frustrated anger, but began to finally talk about his concerns a little time after. The more he talked, the more he explained the situation, and the more the room sobered. When Yule got to the part about the world being separate and being two different time links, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Yule explained all that he could, and sat down tiredly in a chair before his men and women. I won't demand you stay. For all I know, our homes are in danger, and we are launching forward in time by years. If you want to go, you have your markers. I'll personally make sure you get back to the Vale and on the other side myself. I know my decision, as it is. Yule pulled off his obsidian marker stone and held it aloft before him. My wife is dead. My daughter is grown up and living in Montana on the farm. She's safe. She also knows what I told her about me leaving. She knows the deal. I'll be here till whatever end comes to lead you folk, and make sure you get what you need, even if it costs me my soul. Yule looked at the marker stone, then set it down on the table in front of him. Raise your hand if you want to ride the Vale back stateside. There's nothing wrong with saying you want to. A creak filled the room as Yule leaned forward and interlocked his fingers, resting them on top of the marker that lay on the table. Seconds ticked by as the Vale Riders of Cosmoline Company became lost in thought, many of them sliding their hands into their armor or battle jackets to pull out their own obsidian marker. The only way home. Their eyes fell on many things. The markers, the floor, their own boots. Some had small pictures in their wallets or tucked away in a pocket. But all of them had their minds working around one thought. The chance of a lifetime. Every Vale Rider here, including Yule, had signed an insurance policy. If they died, whomever they put down the paperwork would get a lot of money. Naturally, none of them wanted to die, and the thought was very Rick and Morty in nature. In and out, quick 20-minute adventure. Now Yule had laid out the heavy shit. That time was not playing by the rules they knew on Earth, but this new information. That time was not only playing by its own rules, but also putting the gas pedal down and slinging their families into the future was something they did not count on. Seconds. Minutes. Time ticked on in silence as 66 Vale Riders and Yule sat in the Sparkling Unicorn. The elven barmaids were looking at each other worriedly, as even though they didn't know the language, the vibe seeping from those in the dining area was like a cloud that hung over the place. Chix was the first to stand, and her boots thudded softly as she stepped towards Yule, her marker held to her chest with both hands. Yule looked up at her, smiling sadly with his whole face as she came to a stop in front of him. I can get some riders together and get you back within a few Yule's voice slowly drawled away as Chick set down her marker on top of his. Yule looked down at her marker laying on top of his, then back up sharply at Chick's face. She smiled back, and he could see a kind of guilty sadness welling up in her eyes. Her voice broke a bit as she began to speak, but she pulled herself up in a determined posture and cleared her throat. Pretty elf boys and fairies. What's a girl not to like? Yule watched her walk away back towards her chair, and he looked down at the two markers. He heard multiple chairs skirt on the wooden floorboards as they were pushed back and away from the tables, and more thuds of boots echoed their way towards Yule. One by one, 66 Veil Riders dropped their marker stone onto the pile where Chick's had first laid hers. When everyone had dropped their marker and went back to their seat, he looked up and swept his gaze slowly from one side of the room to the other as he etched every face into his memory, and the name to go along with it. Every Veil Rider was standing with their feet together at attention in front of Yule, who slowly rose from his chair, the clink of the markers tinkling as he gathered them all in his left fist. All of you called. Now we're all in. Yule pulled out a roll of 500-mile-per-hour tape and wrapped the OD green strips around and around the markers until just the very bottoms of them poked out. There was a hook on the roof for a lantern, and he tied the tangle of neckbands around the hook after getting on top of a table. The markers hung there like a bundle of herbs made of stone, and Yule jumped down onto the wooden boards with a loud romp of rubber boot soles. He turned around and looked at his Veil Riders, and pulled out a little scroll of paper. Our new friends needed someone to solve a little problem. I told them I know just the people for the job. The roar from the Veil Riders shook the windows of the Sparkling Unicorn. And that's the end of Chapter 5. I know it's a little bit shorter, but I'm trying to do more of these through the week, and it's easier to kind of break them down in smaller chapters so I can get them recorded and sent out, hopefully twice a week, hoping for twice a week, maximum 3 times a week. But in the next chapters, we're going to do a little more world building, letting y'all see the other races and having me describe them. Should be fun. But yeah, I'm also writing up the my Knoll background. Y'all seem to want to know my own little lore on Knoll, so I'm trying to get that written down as well. But yeah, thanks for stopping by. If you liked this video and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to Guardbeardia and click the bell icon so you know when the next Veil Riders is coming out. This has been Guard Bro, and I will see y'all next time.